The morning of the 14th of February, 1929, was cold in Chicago. Snow lay over the north side, and a hard wind came off the lake and down the length of North Clark Street. Inside a plain brick garage, the SMC Cartage Company, 7 men stood in the gray light and waited. Most of them belonged to the crew of George Moran, the bootlegger the newspapers called Bugs. They had come that morning expecting a shipment of whiskey. They were mechanics, drivers, gunmen, and one unlucky optometrist who simply liked the company of dangerous men. A black touring car pulled to the curb outside. Several men climbed out, and 2 of them wore the blue uniforms of Chicago police officers. To the men inside the garage, it looked like an ordinary raid, the kind you paid a fine for and forgot. They set down their coffee. They raised their hands. They turned, without much fear, and faced the whitewashed brick wall. Then the other men lifted their weapons. What followed lasted only seconds. The garage filled with a sound like a great machine tearing itself apart, a hammering roar that rattled the windows and sent pigeons scattering from the rooftops. When it stopped, roughly 70 spent casings lay steaming on the cold concrete, and 7 men lay dead or dying against a wall painted red. A neighbor's dog howled without stopping. When the real police arrived, one victim, Frank Gussenberg, still breathed, with 14 bullets in his body. Asked who had shot him, he answered, "No one shot me," and then he died too. The weapon that did this work had a name. Soldiers had once dreamed of it as a way to save lives. Its inventor was a decorated American general who had spent his career trying to protect the ordinary infantryman. He would have wept to see it here, propping up a wall in a Chicago garage. This is the story of the Thompson, the gun a general built to save soldiers' lives, that became the most infamous weapon in America. To understand the Thompson, you first have to understand the man whose name it carried and the war he was trying to win. John Taliaferro Thompson was born on the last day of December in the year 1860 in Newport, Kentucky. He was a soldier's son, and from boyhood, the Army was less a career than an inheritance. He entered the United States Military Academy at West Point and graduated in the class of 1882, a young officer of sharp mind and restless energy. But Thompson did not become a battlefield commander in the ordinary sense. He found his calling in the Ordnance Department, the branch of the Army responsible for the design, testing, manufacture, and supply of weapons. It was unglamorous work. It was also, Thompson believed, where wars were truly won or lost. For decades, he devoted himself to the machinery of American firepower. He rose steadily through the Ordnance Department, and during the war with Spain and the years that followed, he earned a reputation as one of the Army's most capable and forward-thinking weaponsmen. He played a central role in the adoption of the Springfield rifle, the bolt-action weapon that would arm American soldiers into the world wars. He helped oversee the exhaustive tests that brought the famous .45 caliber pistol into service, tests that were, in their day, among the most demanding trials of firearms ever conducted. He understood, better than almost anyone of his generation, a simple and brutal truth about modern combat, that the side which could put more accurate lead into the air, faster, tended to be the side that walked away. By the time the First World War drew the United States toward its edges, Thompson had reached high rank and great responsibility. When his country entered the war in 1917, he served as the Army's Director of Arsenals, placed in charge of small arms production for a nation suddenly forced to arm millions of men. It was a task of enormous scale and pressure, and he performed it well enough that Congress awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal. He was, in every sense, an establishment figure, a general of factories and drawings and tolerances, not a man one would ever expect to father the most notorious gun in American history. Yet even as he managed the great machinery of wartime production, a private idea was taking shape in his mind, an idea born of the horror he saw unfolding in the fields of France. For the First World War had brought with it a horror that changed how everyone thought about killing. The war on the Western Front had settled into the trenches, 2 lines of men dug into the mud of France and Belgium, separated by a ruined strip of wire and craters called no man's land. To cross it was very nearly to die, Machine guns swept the open ground. A single attack could cost thousands of lives in an afternoon and gain nothing but a few yards of poisoned earth. Thompson, watching from across the ocean, believed the problem was one of engineering. The heavy machine guns of the day were monsters, mounted on tripods, fed by belts, served by teams of men. They were made to defend a line, not to storm one. What the attacking soldier needed, Thompson reasoned, was something entirely new. A weapon a single man could carry in his two hands that could spit a continuous stream of pistol bullets so that a small group of soldiers could leap into an enemy trench and sweep it clean before the defenders could react. He gave this imagined weapon a grim and honest nickname. He called it a trench broom. But there was an obstacle, and it was a problem of physics. A weapon that fires again and again on its own must somehow keep its breech. The rear of the barrel, where the cartridge sits, closed at the instant of firing, and then open it a heartbeat later to eject the spent case and load the next round. Doing this reliably, in a weapon light enough for one man, was the great unsolved puzzle. The known solutions were heavy, complicated, and expensive. The answer, or what seemed like the answer, came from an unexpected source. A retired United States Navy officer named John Bell Blish. Blish had noticed, while observing naval guns, that under very high pressure, certain metal surfaces set at an angle seemed to cling to one another, resisting movement, and then release once the pressure fell. In 1915, he patented this principle, which became known as the Blish lock. It promised a way to delay the opening of the breech using nothing but a cleverly angled sliding piece of bronze, without the weight of a gas system or a heavy recoil mechanism. Thompson saw in Blish's idea the missing piece of his trench broom, and to build it, he needed two things every inventor needs: money and men who could turn theory into steel. The money came from Thomas Fortune Ryan, one of the wealthiest financiers in America, a tobacco and transit magnate with a fortune vast enough to gamble on a soldier's dream. In 1916, with Ryan's backing, Thompson founded the Auto Ordnance Corporation. Its entire purpose was to build the automatic weapon in the general's mind. The men who would actually build it were engineers. Thompson himself was a manager and a visionary, not a machinist, and he knew it. So he hired a talented young engineer named Theodore Eichhoff to lead the practical work, and Eichhoff was soon joined by others, among them a gifted young mechanic named Oscar Payne, whose hands would shape much of the weapon's final form. Much of the real labor happened not in a grand government arsenal, but in a modest workshop in Cleveland, Ohio, where Eichhoff, Payne, and their small team spent long months wrestling with the stubborn realities of the Blish principle. They learned, as engineers so often do, that the theory was not the whole truth. The Blish lock did not truly lock in the way its inventor had imagined. What Blish had described as a mysterious adhesion between angled metal surfaces was, in cold reality, little more than an extreme form of friction. Under the tremendous pressure of firing, the angled bronze piece resisted moving, but it did not hold the breech shut the way a proper locked action would. What it actually did was slow the opening of the breech for a tiny fraction of a second. For a time, the engineers feared this meant the whole idea was a failure. But then they realized something crucial. That fraction of a second, that brief delay, was in fact just enough. With the low-pressure pistol cartridge Thompson had chosen, the weapon did not truly need to be locked at all. It only needed to be slowed. Around this strange, imperfect bronze wedge, they built a compact, brutal little weapon, and by the war's final year, they had something that worked. It was a triumph of engineering built, ironically, on a principle that did not quite do what its inventor claimed. But it fired, and it fired fast. And for General Thompson, that was enough. There was only one problem, and it was catastrophic. They were too late. The great tragedy of the Thompson, the irony that would shadow it for the rest of its existence, was one of timing. The general had built a trench broom for a war of trenches. But as Eichhoff and Payne perfected their design through 1918, the war they had built it for was ending. On the 11th of November, 1918, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. The armistice was signed. The trenches emptied. The weapon meant to sweep them clean had missed its war by a matter of weeks. Not a single Thompson reached the front in anger. Auto Ordnance now owned a finished, remarkable weapon and a world that no longer seemed to need it. The company pressed on regardless. In a board meeting the year after the war, the gun received the name it would carry into history. Some had called the prototype the Annihilator. Now it was christened, formally and forever, the Thompson submachine gun, and Thompson himself is credited with coining that very phrase, submachine gun, to describe a new class of weapon that was lighter than a machine gun but heavier in firepower than any pistol. The first true production model was the model of 1921. Auto Ordnance had no factory of its own capable of the work, so it contracted the job out to the Colt Company, one of the most respected names in American gunmaking. Colt built a run of 15,000 of these weapons. They were, by any measure, beautifully made. The model of 1921 had a finely machined receiver, a blued and finned barrel to help shed heat, elegant wooden furniture, and a forward grip a shooter could hold like the pommel of a saddle. It was less an assembly line tool than a hand-built instrument, and it was priced like one. A single Thompson sold for around $200. To grasp what that meant, consider that in the same era, a brand new Ford automobile cost only a few $100s itself. A working man might labor for months to afford one Thompson. Auto Ordnance had built a weapon of war and priced it like a luxury. So the company went looking for buyers who could pay. Since the Army had gone home, Auto Ordnance turned to the civilian market and to law enforcement. Its advertisements were extraordinary. They pitched the Thompson as a tool of order and protection. One famous illustration showed a cowboy on a ranch, calmly cutting down a gang of mounted raiders with a stream of fire. The gun was marketed to police departments, to banks worried about robbers, to ranchers and property owners, and it was given a wholesome, upright name in these advertisements. It was called the Anti-Bandit Gun. The whole sales pitch rested on a single idea, that this overwhelming firepower belonged in the hands of the good and the lawful, to hold back the wicked. Underneath the marketing, the machine itself was genuinely formidable, and it is worth understanding plainly how it worked. The Thompson fired the .45 caliber pistol cartridge, the same fat, heavy, slow-moving bullet used in the Army's service pistol. This was a deliberate choice. That round did not fly especially far or fast, but at close range it hit like a hammer, and close range was exactly where this weapon was meant to be used. In trenches, in alleys, in rooms. It fed from detachable magazines, and here lay part of its menace and its glamour. There was a simple straight box magazine, holding 20 rounds, that slid up into the weapon from below. And there were the drums, the round canister-shaped magazines that gave the Thompson its unmistakable silhouette. A 50-round drum was common, and a monstrous 100-round drum existed as well, a thick disc of death clipped beneath the barrel. When the trigger was held down, the Thompson could empty a drum in seconds, cycling somewhere in the range of 800 to 900 rounds every minute in its early form. That is more than a dozen bullets every second, faster than the eye could follow. A continuous ripping torrent of .45 caliber lead. For all its firepower, the Thompson was not the easy weapon its legend suggested. It was heavy. It climbed and bucked when fired on full automatic, the muzzle wandering upward as the drum emptied. It was expensive, difficult to control, and it had missed the only war it was designed for. In the early 1920s, sales were dismal. Police departments bought a handful. The military showed little interest. Thousands of those finely made guns sat in storage, waiting for a customer. The customer came, but it was not the one General Thompson had ever imagined. The turning point in the Thompson story was a law, and the law was called Prohibition. On the very cusp of the 1920s, the United States banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol across the entire nation. In doing so, it accidentally created one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in human history. Ordinary Americans still wanted to drink, and where there is demand and no legal supply, the illegal supply grows rich. Overnight, gangs that had once run small local rackets became sprawling business empires, smuggling and brewing and distributing liquor worth fortunes. And where there are fortunes, there are men willing to kill for them. These new criminal organizations were flush with cash and locked in bloody competition for territory. What they needed was firepower, portable, devastating, and available without too many questions. And in those early years, before the law caught up, the Thompson was almost absurdly available. In much of the country, a private citizen could simply buy one. The gangster did not care that it was overpriced or that it wandered off target. He cared that in a single burst, it could shred a rival's car or a rival's body from across a street. The underworld fell in love with the gun and gave it new names. Because of its rapid, chattering fire, which sounded to some ears like the frantic clatter of a typist at a keyboard, and because of its association with the city that became its most famous stage, they called it the Chicago typewriter. They called it the Chicago piano and the chopper. And they called it, simplest of all, the Tommy gun, a nickname that would outlast every gangster who ever held one. It is worth pausing on why the weapon suited the criminal so perfectly, beyond mere firepower. The Thompson was compact enough to conceal under a long coat or inside a violin case, an image that would become a cliché of gangster films precisely because it had roots in reality. It could be brought to bear in an instant, in the tight quarters of a city street, a doorway, the interior of an automobile, and its psychological effect was overwhelming. A single man with a Thompson could dominate a room, could hold a crowd frozen, could turn a getaway into a rolling fortress. For criminals who needed not to win prolonged battles, but to deliver sudden, terrifying, decisive violence and then vanish, the Thompson was almost perfectly designed, though its designer would have been sickened to hear it praised for such things. The names of the men who carried it became American legends of the worst kind. John Dillinger, the charismatic bank robber whom the newspapers followed like a film star, used the Thompson in his raids and escapes. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, the young couple who cut a bloody path across the Midwest, kept Thompsons among their arsenal. And there was George Kelly Barnes, a small-time criminal whose ambitious wife, Catherine, bought him a Thompson, drilled him with it, and spread stories of his deadly skill until the world knew him by a name she helped invent, Machine Gun Kelly. She is said to have handed out spent cartridges as souvenirs, seeding his fearsome reputation. Much of it was theater. The gun made the myth, and then came that garage on North Clark Street, the St. Valentine's Day. Massacre of 1929 was not the first time a Thompson had been used in a gangland killing, but it was the one that seared the weapon into the national imagination forever. 7 men lined against a wall and cut down in seconds by attackers dressed as police, in a crime widely attributed to the organization of Al Capone. The sheer mechanical efficiency of it horrified the country. This was not a duel or a brawl. This was industrial murder, and the Thompson was its machine. Photographs of the bodies ran in newspapers from coast to coast. The image fused permanently in the public mind. The Tommy gun and the massacre, the drum magazine, and the wall of dead men. Here the great irony reached its darkest point. A weapon conceived by a patriotic general to protect the lives of soldiers had become the signature tool of the men who murdered in the streets of American cities. The trench broom had swept no trenches. Instead, it swept down grocers and gunmen and policemen in the long war of Prohibition. It would be wrong, though, to imagine the Thompson served only the criminals. The other side took it up too. As the gangster wars raged, law enforcement scrambled to match the firepower arrayed against them. Police departments bought Thompsons, and the young Federal Bureau of Investigation, which would become the FBI, armed its agents with the very same weapon the outlaws favored. When the government's men finally hunted down the celebrity criminals of the era, they often did so with a Thompson in their own hands. The gun did not care whose finger was on the trigger. It served the hunter and the hunted with the same indifferent efficiency. But it was popular culture that truly immortalized the weapon. The newspapers had made it infamous. Then came the movies. Hollywood discovered that nothing on a screen said danger, glamour, and violence quite like a man in a sharp suit swinging a Thompson. the drum magazine round and heavy, the muzzle spitting fire. Gangster films made the Tommy gun a star in its own right. It became shorthand for an entire era, a single object that meant the roaring, lawless, dangerous 1920s and 30s. The general's trench broom had become, against everything he ever intended, an American icon, and the icon it had become was one of crime. For all its fame, or perhaps because of the wrong kind of fame, the Thompson was failing as a business. Notoriety did not pay the bills, and behind the roaring legend, the Auto Ordnance Corporation was quietly dying. The problem was the one that had haunted the company from the beginning. It had built a superb, expensive weapon for a market that barely existed. The army, at peace, did not want thousands of submachine guns. The police bought only modest numbers. And while gangsters certainly bought Thompsons, they did not buy them in the tens of thousands, and no respectable company could advertise to them anyway. That original run of 15,000 guns from Colt, meant to be the first of many, instead became a stockpile the company struggled for years to sell. The weapon that fired hundreds of rounds a minute sold at a trickle. For General Thompson himself, this was a slow and bitter disappointment. He had poured his reputation, his energy, and much of his later life into this weapon. He had believed it would save soldiers. Instead, he watched it become a byword for murder, its name attached to massacres, its image splashed across the front pages beside the bodies of Prohibition's dead. Friends recalled that he was genuinely saddened, even shocked, to see what his invention had become. He had built a broom for war and given the underworld a scepter. As the years passed, his health declined, and his active role in the company he had founded gradually faded. The general grew old, while his gun grew infamous. The company's finances told the same grim story. Its great patron, the financier Thomas Fortune Ryan, had put up the original fortune that made auto ordnance possible. But Ryan was old, and eventually he died, and his heirs had no romantic attachment to a struggling gun company. To them, auto ordnance was simply a debt, an obligation carried on the books of a wealthy estate, an investment that had never truly paid off. They wanted out. The company drifted, holding patents and unsold guns, running on fumes. Then, the very notoriety that had made the Thompson famous produced a backlash that nearly finished the civilian gun trade it depended on. The nation had watched Prohibition's slaughter with growing horror, and the massacre in Chicago had become a symbol of a country losing control of its own streets. Public pressure mounted for the government to do something about the free flow of these terrible weapons. The answer came in 1934 in a landmark piece of legislation, the National Firearms Act. The National Firearms Act did not ban the Thompson outright, but it did something almost as effective for the ordinary buyer. It placed fully automatic weapons, like the Thompson, under strict federal control. Anyone who wished to own one now had to register it with the government and pay a heavy transfer tax, a tax of $200, a sum equal to the very price of the gun itself, in an era when $200 was a small fortune. In a single stroke, the law made casual ownership of a Tommy gun almost impossible for the average person. The days of simply walking in and buying one, the days that had armed the gangsters, were over. There was a bitter lesson buried in that law, and it was a lesson about consequences. The Thompson had been sold, in its earliest advertisements, as a weapon for the lawful, a tool to keep order and hold back the bandit. Yet it was precisely because that weapon had fallen so easily into the wrong hands, precisely because there had been almost no barrier between a killer and a Tommy gun, that the government now clamped down on all such weapons for everyone. The gun's own infamy had summoned the law that helped to kill its market. Auto ordnance had helped, however, unwittingly, to arm the very men whose crimes now made its product a pariah. For auto ordnance, this was a double blow. The scandal had poisoned the weapon's name, and now the law had strangled what remained of its civilian market. By the late 1930s, the Auto Ordnance Corporation was barely alive, nearly insolvent, sitting on debt and unsold inventory, its founder aging and unwell, its patrons' heirs desperate to be rid of it. The company had no factory of its own, few real assets, and a mountain of obligations. The great dream of the trench broom had come to this: a nearly bankrupt company holding the patents to the most famous gun in America, and almost no one who wanted to buy them. It was, by any reasonable judgment, the end. The general's empire had failed, and then, from two directions at once, salvation arrived. The first savior was a businessman. In 1939, a New York industrialist named Russell McGuire looked at the dying Auto Ordnance Corporation and saw not a failure, but an opportunity. The Ryan estate wanted to unload its controlling stake, and McGuire bought it, purchasing the estate's majority interest for roughly $500,000 and folding the company into his own industrial holdings. He moved its operations to Bridgeport, Connecticut. To many observers, it must have looked like a foolish gamble, pouring money into a notorious, unprofitable relic of the gangster age. But McGuire had seen something across the ocean. In that same year of 1939, war returned to Europe. Germany's armies were on the march, and it did not take a prophet to see that the world was sliding toward a conflict even greater than the last. McGuire understood a simple fact that changed everything. Auto Ordnance held the patents and the tooling for the only submachine gun in America that was ready, right then, for mass production. If the United States went to war, it would need exactly this weapon by the hundreds of thousands. The trench broom's moment, delayed by 20 years, was finally coming. The general did not live to see his vindication. On the 21st of June, in the year 1940, John Taliaferro Thompson died on Long Island, New York, at the age of 79. He was buried, fittingly, at West Point, the academy where his soldier's life had begun. He died still carrying the disappointment of a man whose greatest creation had been turned to ends he despised. He did not know that within a year and a half, his country would be at war, and that his gun, the trench broom the last war had rejected, would arm American soldiers by the million. For when the United States entered the Second World War, the Thompson at last became what its inventor had always meant it to be: a soldier's weapon. On the beaches and in the hedgerows, in the jungles of the Pacific and the villages of Europe, American infantrymen, paratroopers, and Marines carried the Thompson into close combat. And in those short, savage fights, at the mouth of a cave or the corner of a ruined house, the very qualities that made it useless at long range made it deadly up close. The trench broom had finally found its trenches, a generation late. But to arm millions of men, the beautiful, hand-built gun of the 1920s had to change. It was far too expensive and too slow to produce for total war. And so the Thompson was simplified, again and again, each version stripped of the costly refinements of the last. The military versions carried the model designations of their age. There was the model of 1928, adapted for war. Then came the M1, standardized in the spring of 1942, which abandoned the strange Blish lock entirely in favor of a plain, reliable blowback action, because the engineers had finally admitted that the delicate bronze wedge had never been truly necessary. And then the M1A1, standardized that same autumn, simplified even further, with the firing pin machined directly into the bolt. The furniture grew plainer. The finely finned barrel gave way to a plain one. The elegant forward grip became a simple wooden guard. And the drum magazine, that unmistakable badge of the gangster Thompson, was abandoned for military use in favor of the straightforward box magazine, which was cheaper, lighter, and did not rattle when a soldier crawled. The Tommy gun of the movies and the Thompson of the battlefield came to look like distant cousins. To build them in the numbers the war demanded, Auto Ordnance alone was not nearly enough. Production was farmed out on a colossal scale, and the greatest share of the work was done by another famous American firm, the Savage Arms Company, whose factories turned out the bulk of the wartime Thompsons. Between Auto Ordnance and Savage, the plants poured out the weapon at a rate the general could never have dreamed of in the lean years when his finished guns sat unsold in a warehouse. By the war's end, roughly 1.75 million Thompson submachine guns had been manufactured, a staggering figure for a weapon that, 20 years earlier, had struggled to sell a single run of 15,000. More than 1.5 million of those were the simplified wartime models, the plain, robust tools of the citizen soldier, and the relentless drive for efficiency showed nowhere more clearly than in the price. The gun that once cost around $200, hand-fitted and finely finished, was by the middle years of the war being produced for something closer to $45 apiece. In roughly 2 decades, the Thompson had fallen to less than a quarter of its original cost, not because it had grown cheap in quality, but because the desperate arithmetic of total war had stripped away everything that was not essential. The trench broom had at last become what mass warfare required, a mass-produced tool made by the million for a war fought by the million. There is a haunting symmetry in the timing of all this. The weapon had been conceived for a world war and had arrived too late for it. Now, in a second world war, it arrived exactly on time, and the man who had built it lay in his grave at West Point, spared the sight of both his vindication and the ocean of blood in which that vindication was earned. Every crate of Thompsons that rolled out of Bridgeport and out of the Savage plants was, in a sense, a monument to a dead general's stubborn faith, a faith that the world had mocked for 20 years, and now suddenly, desperately needed. And yet, even in triumph, the Thompson carried the seed of its own obsolescence. The very lesson the war taught, that a submachine gun should be cheap, simple, and quick to build, was a lesson the Thompson could never fully learn. It had been born as a precision instrument, and even stripped down, it remained relatively costly and complicated to manufacture compared to what the new age demanded. The Army wanted something even cheaper, a weapon that could be stamped out of sheet metal, almost like a piece of hardware. That weapon arrived before the war was even over. It was the M3 submachine gun, a crude, blocky, utilitarian thing that soldiers, with rough affection, nicknamed the grease gun, because it looked like the tool a mechanic used to grease a car. It fired the same .45 caliber round as the Thompson, but it was made largely of stamped metal and cost only around $20 to build, a fraction of even the wartime Thompson's price. It was ugly. It was awkward. Nobody loved it the way they loved the Tommy gun, but it was cheap, and in a war measured in millions, cheap won. The grease gun was meant to replace the Thompson, and slowly, it did. The Thompson soldiered on through the end of the Second World War and into Korea, a beloved and reliable weapon in the hands of the men who carried it. But its era was ending. The world of the submachine gun was moving toward stamped steel, and, soon enough, toward the assault rifle, which would make the pistol-caliber submachine gun itself seem quaint. The general's gun had finally won its war, and in winning it, had been made obsolete by the very future it helped create. So what became of the Thompson, and of the empire that bore the general's name? The Auto Ordnance Corporation, resurrected by war, did not vanish when the fighting stopped, though its great days were behind it. The company and its famous name passed through the decades and through other hands, a piece of American history, bought and sold. Today, the Auto Ordnance name lives on under the ownership of Car Arms, which since the closing years of the 20th century has produced faithful reproductions of the classic Thompson for collectors and enthusiasts. These modern versions, built from the original engineering drawings, fire 1 round per pull of the trigger, rather than the roaring automatic bursts of old. But in silhouette, they are unmistakable. The finned barrel, the wooden grip, the round drum. Men still buy them, not for war and not for crime, but for the love of a legend. And a legend is what the Thompson truly became, larger than any of the men who made it or used it. It outlived General Thompson, who died believing his creation had been perverted. It outlived Thomas Fortune Ryan, whose fortune had funded it, and whose heirs had abandoned it. It outlived the gangsters who made it infamous, and the soldiers who redeemed it. The gun endured, and endures still, as one of the most recognizable objects ever forged in America. Its meaning, though, remains strangely divided, as if the weapon itself could never decide what it was. To one American, the Thompson is the gun of the gangster, the Chicago typewriter, the machine of the massacre, an emblem of a lawless and violent age. To another, it is the gun of the liberator, slung over the shoulder of a young soldier wading ashore to free a continent, a symbol of American courage in the greatest war ever fought. It is at once the outlaw's weapon and the hero's, the tool of murder and the tool of rescue. Both are true. Both are the same gun. And in the end, that is the strangest fate of all for the general's trench broom. John Taliaferro Thompson set out to build a machine that would save soldiers' lives. He built it too late for the war he intended, and lived to watch it become the most infamous weapon in his country, its name spoken in the same breath as murderers. He died a disappointed man, just before history would finally hand his creation the redemption he had prayed for. The gun outlived the man. It outlived his company, his patron, and his empire, and it carried his name forever into a legend he neither wanted nor could ever have imagined. The story of the gun a general built to save lives that became the most infamous weapon in America. If you found this story worth your time, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We tell the true stories of the weapons, the inventors, and the fallen empires that shaped America, one forgotten history at a time. Your subscription helps us keep digging into the archives and bringing these stories to light. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.